All right, looking at the questions. Of course, we've been a long time getting through this particular material for various reasons. Question number one: Where did Jesus go after being tempted? Where did he go after being tempted? And specifically where? Does it not say that? Does it not talk about him going to Bethabara? It may be some of the supplemental material that I've read. All right, but he did go to Galilee. He went beyond the Jordan where John was baptizing. Do you remember? This is not in your questions, but do you remember what we talked about with regard to the prefix Beth, B-E-T-H, now, which, by the way, is also the name of the second Hebrew letter. You remember what we said when you have a word that begins with Beth, B-E-T-H? What that indicates? It means house. It means house. Bethlehem means the house of bread. Hey, Dennis. I was going to throw one out on Dennis, and I was going to put him on the spot, but he's not going to come out. Does the name Bethesda mean anything to you? Bethesda, particularly Bethesda, Maryland. There's a military hospital there. Yep, it's a military hospital. Bethesda means house of mercy. In other words, a lot of times the things that we read have meanings to them. And Bethesda is the house of mercy. Bethlehem is the house of bread. Where John was baptizing at Bethabara means it's called the house of the ford. The house of the ford. Not the car. The ford over the river. And what that means is it was a place where the river was shallow enough where people could get in it and be baptized. It's where people would, and it was a natural crossing of the Jordan River. And so again, a lot of these names have specific meanings that are helpful to us as we study those things. All right. Then second question is, John was the Elijah foretold by which prophet? Who? Well, I think there's actually two. I think there's two correct answers. I think he's looking for one in particular. Behold, I send you Elijah the prophet before the great and dreadful day of the Lord. Malachi chapter 4, verse 5. But also Isaiah. Who are you? I'm the voice of one crying in the wilderness. Zacharias is the father of John the Baptist. And so John was the Elijah foretold. Now look, obviously Zacharias made some statements about John, but not in the prophetic sense, I think, in which the question is asked. So I think Malachi is the answer we're looking for, and Isaiah also is a part of that foretelling. All right. How did John introduce Jesus in John 1 and verse 29? How did he identify him? Behold, the Lamb of God, who does what? There you go, John. He takes away the sins of the world. And so that's an interesting moniker to hang on Jesus. The first time that you think about, John identifies Jesus for the very first time to this group of people, some of whom are going to be the apostles. And he identifies him as the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. All right. The next question. This has to do with some of the goings on with regard to when Jesus went to a certain house. We talked about this briefly. How did the Jews reckon time? How did they reckon time? In other words, how did they account for time? Sun up to sundown, or sun up to sun up. In other words, the day started when the sun came up, and the next day started when the sun came up. All right, but how did the Romans reckon time? Like we do, midnight to midnight. Now this obviously comes into play, it's going to come into play when we get down to the section of the crucifixion, because some of the things are going to be said about Jesus in regard to his crucifixion, where he was crucified, the third hour of the day, and there was darkness from the 6th hour to the 9th hour. And, that would be from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. or the 6th hour would have been noon to 3 p.m. And then you read John's account of the crucifixion, and you find it says Jesus was in the presence of Pilate at the 6th hour of the day. So, well, wait a minute. Matthew, Mark, and Luke said that Jesus was on the cross on the 6th hour. And John says that Jesus is in Pilate's hall at the 6th hour. And when we make the distinction between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, obviously writing well before the destruction of Jerusalem and writing to a group of people at the time when the Jews were still a people, that would make sense. And then John writing 20 years after the destruction of Jerusalem, and the Jews are, what Jews weren't slaughtered, in Jerusalem were scattered to the four corners of the earth as fugitives and slaves. And so John's writing in regard to Romans, because by then nobody was keeping Jewish time, because the Jewish people had essentially been obliterated in the destruction Jerusalem. Obviously, there were Jews who were not at Jerusalem that were scattered throughout the world, but as far as being a nation, influential people, those days had long passed by the time John wrote his gospel. All right, what are the meanings of Cephas and Peter? What's the meaning of the word Cephas, or the meaning of the word Peter? Rock or stone. A rock or stone. By the way, what was his real name? Simon. Yeah, Simon the son of Jonah. But it's one of those things where he's never called. After Jesus hangs this name on him, at times you'll find him as Simon Peter. Yeah, and it would distinguish him from other Simons, which obviously was a very common name. I'm sure it was probably a form of the Jewish Simeon. If I were guessing, I haven't looked that up, but I would. If you made me guess or speculate, I'd say Simon's a form of Simeon, one of the 12 sons of Jacob. But the word rock or stone is the name that Jesus, and I say he hung it on him, and that's not in a negative way. It's just that Jesus gave him or bequeathed that name or whatever on Simon, Cephas or Peter. And by the way, Peter is the predominant word that's found for the rest of the biblical record. But yet Paul used the term Cephas in 1 Corinthians chapter 1. I am of Paul, I am of Apollos, I am of Cephas, I am of Christ. And so both words or both names appear throughout the rest of the New Testament text. All right, what is the most common term used for members of the early church? Not name. What's the most common term? Disciples. Disciples is used over and over and over again. The word Christian is found about 3 times in our New Testament. It's found when the name was given to the disciples. The disciples were called Christians first at Antioch, Acts 11:26. Then Agrippa made the statement, "You almost persuade me to become a Christian," in Acts 26. And then Peter uses the term in 1 Peter 4 and verse 16 when he says, "If any man suffer as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but rather let him glorify God in this name." So Christian appears 3 times, but disciples is the term. Christian is the name, disciple is the term. And obviously there's a difference between a term and a name. Another term used for Christians was saints. Right? So, those are identifying terms that had specific meanings, but the name is Christians. But the most common term was disciples. By the way, what does disciple mean? Just as a follower or a learner. The Bible speaks of, John had his disciples. And John's disciples questioned Jesus' disciples, and the other way around. So the term disciple or follower, learner is the common term, and I like that terminology.
So when you try to take on a trade, you essentially become a disciple.
That's right. I mean, yeah, right, and it doesn't even have to be religious. It can be philosophical. You had, Socrates had his disciples, Plato had his disciples, Aristotle had his disciples, and so. And even it goes on today that there are people that follow other people in that way. In my opinion, not generally in a good way, but it still goes on today. Question 7: where did Jesus perform his first miracle? Wedding feast, and where was he? Cana of Galilee. Cana of Galilee. Again, Galilee is an important identification because it was a place where there were Gentiles, Galilee of the Gentiles. And so, obviously, what was Jesus' first miracle? Turn water to wine. And what is the meaning of the Greek word oinos? Wine or juice. And what determines the use? What determines how we're to understand that word when it's found in the Bible? Well, but how do we know? How do we know if the Bible is speaking about alcoholic wine or non-alcoholic juice? Well, that's one way. What I'm looking for is context. In other words, you can't just see the word and assume it means one thing or the other. The context in which it's used.
If it says wine, it could be either. If it says new wine, it's juice.
That's right. If it says new wine, it would most likely be some type of juice. But then even new wine has a nuance to it, because it says you don't put new wine in old wineskins. And yet on the day of Pentecost, the apostles were accused of being full of new wine. So again, context is going to determine usage. When they accused the disciples of being full of new wine, they meant alcoholic wine, because Peter said, "These men are not drunken as you suppose, seeing it is but the third hour of the day." And when he said third hour of the day, he meant 9 a.m. because he was reckoning on Jewish time. It's only the third hour of the day. And how?
Man.
How do they make non-alcoholic wine?
Oh, Todd and I actually batted some stuff back and forth, but it would have been just pressed grape. But there's other ways to preserve that.
Yeah, that's what you're asking, right? How do you preserve it?
Keep the alcohol out of it.
I would say so. You could dry the grape, make a raisin, and it would last, and then reconstitute it. Right? They did that a lot. Or you could boil it down. Now, these people didn't. It was other parts of the world. But they would make a thick syrup out of it and then reconstitute it in water.
Yeah.
And something that I never thought of, I read a thing. They said that area of the world is like a crossroads in the weather or meteorology.
Right.
And there's different strains of grape that will allow you to. Some grapes actually produce twice a year, and there was some that produced early and some that produced late. So it is entirely possible that they could have still had a fall pressing and then one toward what we call the first of the year.
Yeah, like a market, yeah, something gathered up in the marketplace and not necessarily grown.
Yeah.
But boiling it and sealing it was the most common way to keep it from turning into fermented.
And seal it.
Yeah, pasteurize it and then seal it. And,
Seal it in a churn or.
yeah, some type of clay jar, and then it would be sealed with wax or clay, or sealed with clay with a wax, it'd be an airtight lid on it.
It was entirely possible for them to have grape juice year round.
Yeah. Not only possible, it was
Yeah.
a way of life.
Yeah.
It was a way of life. All right. Let's see. Number 10. I don't remember if this was it. I don't remember reading this. How is the word miracle used in the Bible? How's the word miracle used in the Bible? All right, something done by God's power. And I think we can even go a step further than that. And that would be something done by God's power that without any question demonstrates that the natural laws of the world have been suspended or superseded.
No other explanation.
There's no other explanation other than what we might refer to as a divine intervention. In other words, there's no way to explain water being put in. God turned water to wine all the time. If you considered that it rained and grapes were made, and those grapes turned to juice. But that's a natural explanation. But when you fill a water pot full of water, and by the time you get from the back room to the front room, that water is wine, there's only one explanation. When a man is raised from the dead, there's no, all these, it amazes me. How many times have you seen on television or online or whatnot where people have come back from the dead? They've come back from the dead. Well, no, they didn't. The Bible says the body apart from the spirit is dead. James 2 and verse 26. And so, so we want to, and I think the reason it's asking this is because we have to be very careful in how we use terminology. We can talk in colloquialisms about miracles. A few years ago, the Tennessee Titans won a football game on the last play of the game. One guy ran over to one side of the field on a kickoff and threw it to the other side of the field, and the guy caught it and ran it in for a touchdown. And you know what they call that play? The Music City Miracle. The Music City Miracle. If you saw not too many days ago, Franco Harris died. Franco Harris is, if you had to attach one single event to the entire career of Franco Harris, it's going to be called the Immaculate Reception. The Raiders were fixing to beat the Steelers, and that pass was made across the middle. Some guy from the Raiders came through and broke up the pass, and for some reason he hit the ball and it went right in a bullet backwards and hit Franco Harris right in the hands, and he ran it in for a touchdown. Well, they say it was the Immaculate Reception. 1980 Olympics, United States versus the Russians. What is it? Thank you, Philip. The Miracle on Ice. We use the term in a colloquial sense a lot. And look, there's nothing in the world wrong with it when we all understand what we're talking about. But a lot of things are attributed to the miraculous that are not miraculous. The Bible, if we're going to use the term in the biblical sense, it has to be an event where the laws of nature are superseded in an obvious way that people can draw no other conclusion other than God has intervened in a matter. You raise the dead. You take a man with a withered hand and you restore that hand. A man born blind gets his sight. The man who's never walked jumps up and starts running around. He's 40 years old and never walked. Obviously, those are miracles. And so we want to, make sure that speaking in biblical sense, we want to use the term properly. All right. What was John's favorite word for miracle? What word did he like to use? Sign. This is in John 2 and in verse 11. This beginning of signs Jesus did. Now, if you were reading ahead and into the next lesson with regard to the temple, you would see that the Jews asked Jesus, by what sign? What sign do you do that gives you the authority to do these things? In verse 23, many believed in his name when they saw the signs. The signs.
Glory. Verse 11. That forth his glory.
Well, the signs manifested his glory, but the word glory is not the synonym for miraculous. The signs manifest his glory. And then Nicodemus, Master, we know you're a teacher come from God, for no man can do the signs that you do except God be with him. So like 4 or 5 times here in John 2 and the early part of John 3, John's using the word signs. Then he closes the book. And truly many other signs did Jesus in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these are written that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you might have life in his name. John used the term signs a lot to refer to the miraculous. Now let me just ask you, why would he do that? Why would he use the word? Why would he use the word signs as opposed to miracle or mighty deeds? What does a sign do? Not a miracle sign. What does a sign do? It points you in the right direction, right? So John, what was the purpose of John? What was the entire purpose of John's gospel? Was to point to Jesus as being God. Matthew presents him as the son of Abraham and the son of David. Mark presents him as the servant king. Luke presents him as the wise man, the son of the Son of Man. John presents him from the beginning as the Son of God. In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God. The Word was God. Opening line. So John uses this term intentionally because he's trying to point people to Jesus as being divine. That's the whole point of John's book. It's pointing to Jesus as being divine. Not the descendant of anybody. He points to him as being God. And so the word sign, I think, is used intentionally because it's trying to point people in a specific. And everybody can see a sign. That's right. A sign is designed to be seen. What good is a billboard if nobody sees it? That's right. Or if it doesn't have anything on it. That's right. That's right. Notable evidence. Acts 4, verse 16. All right. What was the hometown of Peter and Andrew? Bethsaida, I believe. I got Bethsaida. All right. By the way, what was Peter by trade? A fisherman. Guess what the word Bethsaida means? House of fish. It's the house of fish. See, words mean, these things mean things. These words, these names mean things. Peter was a fisherman, and he lived in Bethsaida, the house of fish. Also known as Jay's Country Squire. That's Lamar County talk from Bethsaida. All right, what was the location of Capernaum? All right, it was on the north coast of the Sea of Galilee. Right, it was on the Sea of Galilee. It's on the north coast, and by the way, Capernaum means house of Nahum. It was believed that was Nahum's hometown. I don't think there's any definitive proof, but it was believed at that time. All right, let's move on to the matter of the temple in verses 13 through 25. We'll read this text together, and this lesson's going to be, this is a fairly short lesson. When you take the pictures out of it, it's less than 2 pages. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to read the text, verses 13 to 25 together. We'll talk a little bit about the lesson, and then Lord willing, next week we'll do the questions for this lesson and move into the next lesson. Does that work? And then I'll have the follow-up lessons printed and ready to go, hand out next week. So keep us on track. All right, John 2, verse 13 through 25. After the miracle at the wedding feast in Cana, it says that Jesus went to Capernaum, but they did not stay there many days. So it seems to be a natural transition that they didn't stay there many days because of the Passover. It doesn't say that particularly or specifically, but that seems to be the natural reading in verse 13. Now the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. And he found in the temple those who sold oxen and sheep and doves, and the money changers doing business. When he had made a whip of cords, he drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen, and poured out the changers' money, and overturned the tables. And he said to those who sold doves, "Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of merchandise." Then his disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house has eaten me up." So the Jews answered and said to him, "What sign do you show to us, since you do these things?" Jesus answered and said to them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." Then the Jews said, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple. Will you raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking of the temple of his body. Therefore, when he had risen from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this to them, and they believed the scriptures and the word which Jesus had said. Now when he was in Jerusalem at the Passover during the feast, many believed in his name when they saw the signs which he did. But Jesus did not commit himself to them, because he knew all men and had no need that anyone should testify of man, for he knew what was in man. All right, in the lesson here, on the first page of lesson plan 14, you see this is a fairly common representation of the temple and how it was laid out. And you see on the picture this. It's not pictured in its entirety, but you see that big outer court, that surrounds the intersection on 3 sides. Now that outer court was called the court of the Gentiles, and then there was at some point what was called a court of women, and then a court of men. In other words, the female Jews were allowed, for lack of a better term, closer access to the most holy place. And then the men were allowed even closer access. And then, of course, the holiest of holies was the place that the high priest only went once a year. And so, and I'm going to be honest with you, I haven't studied the history of the temple enough to know, but it's my understanding that all of these divisions of the temple court and whatnot are man-made. In other words, I don't remember reading anything in my Old Testament studies about where God said, now so-and-so can't come here and women can't come here. And I think these are all man-made distinctions. And if I'm wrong, I will accept. 'Cause if I'm wrong, it means I've learned something. But somebody may have studied that in greater detail. But this is a fairly common representation of the temple of Herod. It was Herod the Great, who reigned for many, many years prior to and up through the birth of Christ. And they even give you credit. They even give credit. Said this picture came from Wikipedia, and it talks about the court of the Gentiles is this outer court, and also, one thing we have to remember is when we look at these models, we don't really gain an understanding of really how large this court may have been. Because I believe it was J.W. McGarvey was speaking about when the apostles preached in the outer court of the temple, that literally thousands of people could have been accommodated in this outer court. And so when you're looking at this model, you really have to envision it, in your mind how massive this area was. And so you have this situation of the Passover and this feast, and there were things that were required of the Jews at the Passover. One was to pay a temple tax, or what was called the temple tax. Now, the interesting thing is, when it was instituted, there was no temple. It was more of a tabernacle tax. And because it was instituted in Exodus 30 in verse 13, and the temple wasn't built for hundreds of years after Exodus 30. But there was a half shekel required of every single man, regardless of his wealth or social status, who he was. If you were 20 years old and up, you paid the temple tax. And it was, I guess, to go to the upkeep, at that time, the upkeep of the tabernacle. I would have assumed it would have been part of the, I don't want to use the word salary, but the remuneration for the priests. In other words, to help the priests, keep up the priests.
Did they get their sins rolled forward at the same time to pay tax?
No, sir. The sins were rolled forward at the offering of on the Day of Atonement, and on the Day of Atonement was when there was an animal that was sacrificed, and then one that was driven out into the wilderness. Obviously, one shed the blood, and then in the other one was pictured the removal of sins from the people. And so you have this half shekel temple tax. And then also there were sacrifices that were to be made at the Passover. And so the situation as it exists here is that you have to remember the Jews have been scattered to the four corners of the earth. We read that in Acts chapter 2. There were dwelling at Jerusalem Jews, devout men out of every nation under heaven. And it runs them from Rome to Asia Minor to Africa. You have Jews all over. And the sacrifices were specific. The lamb or turtle doves, based on your ability, your financial ability. We talked about, Jesus' family offered the sacrifice of the poor when they brought him and presented him in the temple. That wasn't a Passover offering, but there were distinctions made. So, you think about, you have to have a lamb without spot and without blemish. And you live in Rome, and you're going to have to make a trip from Rome to Jerusalem. You can't. You're not going to be able to bring that lamb with you. If you were in Asia Minor or Africa, you're not going to be able to bring that. Too many bad things can happen between where you are and where you're going. If that lamb sustains an injury, guess what? It's not any count to offer. So what was going on here? Well, the local Jews had set up a giant flea market in the court of the Gentiles. And there's all these booths and all these stalls. And there were a number of things going on. You had people selling lambs. And by the way, the word lamb there is a sheep or a goat. When we hear lamb, we all automatically think sheep. But a goat also, a young goat also was acceptable. So you have these booths with all of these animals that have been brought in to be sold to the foreign Jews so that they can have something to sacrifice. Well, if you're a Jew traveling from Cappadocia or Rome or Egypt, they've got you over a barrel. You know, it's not just a matter that you're providing a service. It's not just a matter that you're providing a service for your brethren. You're making merchandise of your brethren. You've got them, you've got them in a bad way. Also, the temple tax had to be paid. Had to be paid with Jewish money. So you got exchange, money changers. Like for example, when we go to Africa, or wherever it is that we go, the first thing we do is we got to go to what's called the Forex Bureau. And we got to trade American money for Ghanaian money. So, and guess what? They make money off me when I do that. Like let's just say if I go to Ghana and the exchange rate is 5,000 cedis to the dollar. Okay, well guess what? When I go to the Forex Bureau, I'm only going to get about 4,600 or 4,500 CDs to the dollar. Because that guy's got to, he can't just trade, you can't just trade money and make money. So, and the interesting thing is, the Muslims always paid more than the Forex Bureau. And the Chinese always paid more than the Forex Bureau. So a lot of times we changed money at the Chinese restaurant. We'd go down there to a place on the beach and we'd eat. And we'd say, hey, while we're here, we need to change out about 1,000 US dollars. And them Chinese, they had money. And they would give you a better exchange rate than the Forex Bureau. And so, but that's what's going on here in this temple court. People are coming from all over and they're bringing Roman coins and Egyptian coins or Asian coins or wherever. And those things can't be put in the temple box. And so we're going to get you on the exchange rate. We're going to charge you. By the way, in the Old Testament, those types of actions were forbidden. When you loaned one of your Jewish brethren money, how did God tell you to do that? Without what? Interest or usury. That's the word I was looking for. Without usury. In other words, without a charge for using my money. And so what they were doing was actually a violation of the spirit, if not the actual statements of the law of Moses. And so that's why Jesus was so adamant about this situation. All right, now Lord willing, we'll pick up there next Sunday morning.